It's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Mr. Michael Susong. Mr. Susong has a long career in the intelligence profession, serving both in the Army and the CIA and working at many other interesting places. One of the remarkable things is that for his work he was awarded the Intelligence Star, which is an award that the CIA gives for extraordinary heroism. Today he's going to talk about how we might apply some of the principles that are commonly used in the intelligence profession to IT security. I'm sure it's going to be a really exciting talk, and I just hope he doesn't tell us anything such that he'll have to kill us afterwards. So please welcome our speaker.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And while we talk, I want to make sure everyone feels free to ask questions. Despite the caveat, you can ask anything. And if you have any interest in my past career in regards to kind of what that's really all about, and I'll try to throw in a few war stories, no additional charge, so I'll be glad to do that. Do appreciate the chance to participate here at CyLab. Follow the program at the university with great interest, and seen a lot of real advancements and some really innovative ideas come out of the lab and the university as well. So I want to try to contribute in any small way that I can. I will offer up in full disclosure, and to date myself a little bit. I've always had a career in my working with high technology fields, whether it was weapons of mass destruction, specifically biological weapons, or with the industries I've worked with that have been high technology. The last time I actually did any coding was in Fortran on 80-column IBM cards. So if any of you take the history of computing, maybe you'll understand what that was all about. So I would defer to everyone in the room as far as your skills. And at the same time, I guess I'm a bit of a heretic at the university in that my background has always been in human intelligence. My belief being that, and it's, I think, well-founded, being that at the end of the day, there's someone doing the coding, there's a signature, there's an art to it, there's characteristics, and someone's motivated either to commit a crime or to look through a weakness for a software program or otherwise. So I always take it from the human intelligence point of view, and so that's where I'll apply a lot of those principles as we talk today. And again, as I talk, I do encourage questions at any time. You won't break my train of thought. There's no sequence here that we have to meet on any timeline. Okay. As any intelligence officer talks, they'll talk about two things: the threat environment that they operate in, and the threat actors. And we'll elaborate on both of those just a little bit. As you look through the slides, really the world that the intelligence professional or the IT security professional works in continues to expand. As I use the expression, Intel inside and Microsoft outside, in the sense that anywhere you learn basic IT, you're going to touch kind of the hardware architecture and the software, the operating systems that are used, and there's a pretty finite world that is. For good or bad, we can debate that. But the point is, anybody, whether intentions are good or bad, kind of have a finite field that they work in. So to develop skills, to look at the weaknesses, to find out how to exploit something is pretty small that you can go into. Some people argue with Apple or the old saw that it's security through obscurity. Certainly, as more people program in those languages, have more exposure, as the platforms cross interoperate in application level, again, that breaks down. You look at corporate data, personal identifiable information, which at the very least at one time was tried to be kept securely within a bank or with a financial transaction institution. Now that information comes up on Citrix servers for our call centers scattered around the world for various companies. You look at all the smartphone applications. So again, that data is being pushed further out onto more platforms, operating under more applications, and more exposure, if you will, to being exploited. The way in, if you look at the TJ Maxx hack several years ago, Somebody was war dialing in a parking lot at a TJ Maxx store and got in through the point of sale back into the corporate network. So those examples continue to this day, and that exposure, if you will, vulnerability in the broadest sense, not in a technical sense in a software program, continue to expand. Looking at critical infrastructure, the industry I last came from, I'll speak to that in general, whereas before those were very kind of locks and doors and proprietary software systems, air-gapped and isolated physically and electronically from the rest of the network, now are written and operate on open platforms with a lot of internet connectivity. So that exposure is increased. And again, although I think it's a move in the right direction for the country and the industry, if you look at the smart grid, my analogy is if you have a smart meter at your home, it's basically a small computer hanging on the side of your house with 2 radio transmitters on it, operating in a mesh network with potentially millions of nodes, talking to the toaster and the iPad and your web-enabled vehicle. What could possibly go wrong with that? So this is the environment that we really operate in from a security level, and as you look at from an Intel point of view, the threat that you're exposed to. There's always a set of actors, threat actors, that the intelligence community always defines. And these are my own definitions. They're certainly nothing original, but it seems to capture the main areas that we encounter when we look at incidents. The insider, really there's 2 kinds of insiders. Present company accepted, it's usually in the IT department. Someone who has an intent and they know the network and they intend to do some damage to it. And then you have the benign insider, which is what I refer to as the employee who has maybe admin access, or that hasn't been disabled on their computer, or they just have broad access within the network by their responsibilities. And at lunchtime they go to ESPN and check some sports scores, or go to a website somewhere else and they inadvertently download something. But nonetheless, from a point of view looking at it as a threat, we look at those individuals. They're not, the intent is not to hunt these people out and hound them down, as an employee. Their mistake is innocent, but nonetheless it's an exposure. Hacktivists we'll talk a little bit more about in detail, but that's kind of a new category, if you will, that I've added to the threat actor scenario, and we'll talk a little bit about anonymous as an example of that here in a bit. Criminals, I've seen a lot of the work by CyLab and the university, and individuals have a lot of expertise and have spoken very eloquently on how those groups try to exploit corporate networks, critical infrastructure, government networks as well. Terrorists, for different reasons, but still using the network as a way to get in, to gather information, to look at weaknesses, to look at potential targets from their point of view. And nation states. It's the great game that's never changed. One country looking to find a tactical or a strategic advantage or obtain information that's more beneficial to them at the expense of another nation. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the tools, techniques, and procedures when we use our example. Anybody have any questions or comments on this categorization? Anything that could be better or more clearly defined? We all good? Yes.
I guess you could also just have vandals.
Yeah, vandals are certainly individuals who they're just for the act of the hack, and we grappled with that a little bit. Probably for simplicity, I've thrown that into hacktivists, but you're right. It's not really a clear category that you could put under hacktivists. Dated by about a year, but we'll bring it into the current when we talk about it. Anonymous groups attack on Sony Corporation. People familiar with that particular hack? Yes, no? Good, then I can embellish it all I want and nobody can really call me on this. And I speak to 3 of the groups. That's why I use this one example. 3 of the groups of the 5 threat actors were involved, for my definition, were involved in this particular event. Probably most people are familiar with Anonymous. It's a very loosely defined, wouldn't even call it a coalition, affiliation. It evolved out of 4channel.org, and anybody who's been to 4channel.org can appreciate the character and timbre of 4channel. Kind of started as an image posting site, but really a kind of a hacker ethos. Japanese anime and pornography was kind of its origin. So you have a very, some case benignly anarchical kind of group, and in some cases people have ill intentions. And certainly, as demonstrates even today in the New York Times, one of the more aggressive groups that we've seen to date. They kind of gained their notoriety on the heels of WikiLeaks. When WikiLeaks, the founder of WikiLeaks was being prosecuted, and then the large leak by Bradley Manning was revealed, there was a call by WikiLeaks, the group, to solicit funds to support their activities. Some of the larger financial transaction companies, PayPal, the credit cards, shut down the link so that they would not allow transactions for WikiLeaks. That's when really kind of Anonymous, probably to the news, kind of reared their head and got involved. They did DDoSes against PayPal and the credit cards, to try to impact their business. That was over a span of about 2 or 3 days. Some of it was, if I can get the clever name they used, the low orbital geocanon. It was a software download where you could kind of let your computer be part of the DDoS, kind of volunteer to be part of the bot army. And at the same time, by public sources, they also then apparently bought some botnets, some bot armies to participate in the DDoS, which kind of raised the threshold to the point made earlier. You see a lot of hacking activity, which is just kind of to try to do a DDoS, don't really mean any grand harm, and they kind of leave it at that. But when they then kind of took that next step over into using a clearly illegal and criminal tool, a bot army, that kind of raised their profile and certainly begin to get people's interest in what they were doing. As a result of Anonymous's support of WikiLeaks by doing the DDoS, the FBI opened a case, an investigation against Anonymous. Again, this amorphous group, but nonetheless to try to find out who was involved. And they used a company called H.B. Gary Federal. H.B. Gary is an established company that does a lot of very good IT security. And H.B. Gary Federal was a piece of their company. And the FBI enlisted their support against Anonymous. This is kind of where the story begins to unfold and things begin to kind of run off the rails for H.B. Gary Federal. Anonymous, again, we're using this broad term, turned its attention on H.B. Gary Federal. And over the course of about 21 days, all these events took place. They socially engineered their way into the president's account, changed his password so that they gained control of his account. They remotely wiped his iPad. I believe they had control of their network for about 30 hours. They deleted their backups. They defaced the websites. They posed as the president on, I think it was some of the social media sites that had to be obviously then countermanded. And I'm thinking that's pretty much a boatload of activity on their part. And then very significantly, they made some physical threats against H.B. Gary employees at their booth at RSA in San Francisco last year. So it kind of went from the virtual world to the physical world. Again, you keep seeing this escalation of this particular group. And towards the end of February, the president of H.B. Gary Federal resigned. I mean, the impact was just kind of unrecoverable at that point. So that's H.B. Gary. Anonymous, again, this could be completely different groups, but under this umbrella title, they defend George Holtz, who jailbroke the PlayStation 3, said he had a right to do it, and that was his argument. And a lot of the gamers encouraged that and supported that, which was a Sony product. Sony said they would take Holtz to trial over this, that he violated law. That's when a portion of Anonymous then turned their attention to Sony. It really kind of took three phases there. The first attack, called Op Sony, was about a 5-day period, and that was a DDoS to disable or prevent the global player-to-player network from operating. They were relatively successful. One side note is a lot of the members of Anonymous were also gamers, and they said, this is really not such a good idea. Let's stop this. So that's why that part of the Op Sony was short-lived. The second attack, Sony Recon, was an attempt to infiltrate and gain information about the Sony executive and Sony corporate information. Some information was leaks and emails, that sort of thing. So that was the second phase. The third was a non-ops. In this particular case, was where they actually were hitting the Sony servers and had infiltrated a big portion of their revenue-generating network to the point which I think this is fundamentally key. Sony shut down their own networks for, I think, over 3 weeks. And that's how impactful it was and how much damage this did. And as I make the point, revenue-generating networks. The president of Sony was later quoted, as you see below, which is kind of a damning statement to have to make, or to feel that you're going to make, that you really can't. You want people to game, you want them to interact over your networks, you want them to have a level of trust, and on the other hand, you really can't make any promises about how secure that can be. So the impact was profound. And you see numbers tossed around about the financial damage to Sony. You can argue the range, but it was, I don't think anybody would argue it was under a billion with B damage, both direct and indirect to the network. Just speak up.
So one thing I'm curious about, it seems like Anonymous is especially profound in this, that they seem to take incidents where they've been they feel they've been ethically wronged and retaliate in an unethical manner, but then they make public releases about exactly why they're doing the things that they're doing. I don't see other groups or news stories where this happens to that extent. A lot of times you'll see agencies or companies' websites defaced, hijacked, and they don't really give it an explanation, whereas Anonymous is very clear as to explaining how they feel they've been wronged. Is that accurate, or?
I think it is accurate, and I think it has a couple of dimensions, and you bring up a good point. Before, for whatever reason, usually it was criminal enterprise would hack into a network to steal the data, and kind of nothing was said or heard of. In fact, low and slow was the way they wanted to operate. These are far more blatant in that regard as far as the public image. And I guess you could kind of take it from 2 points of view. One, they're attempting to justify their actions within a larger social community, whether it's legitimate or not, but they have a voice for that. And then on the other hand, you haven't really seen an example of anybody doing that before. So that's kind of brought it to the next level. What happens, I think, on occasion, theory, is, and again, we're using this very amorphous term, anonymous. Someone in Anonymous that's affiliated with it are pinging networks or scanning networks and looking for a vulnerability in the network. Let's say they find one in company A, and it's a mom and pop bed and breakfast in the Midwest. They may mess around with it. They may just walk away. Then they're pinging another network, and it's, again, I'm making these up as hypotheticals. It's a big bank, based in New York City. then they've kind of given them the justification from a social point of view, maybe, of making this claim of why they're now hacking Bank X. Is there really any difference on the hack other than they can kind of give it some kind of social justification? So I think you see a bit of that. Sometimes it's absolutely, they didn't like what Sony did to Holtz, and they kind of, different groups, I think, within Anonymous kind of went after them. To that point, if you look at the 3 phases of the Sony hack, I think the first one was first attack, Op Sony, was the hacktivist group within Anonymous who thought what they did to Holtz was wrong, and so they were going to do something about it. The Sony Recon, is that kind of the lulsec crowd of Anonymous lulsec, being a shorthand for kind of laugh out loud, a joke, prankster kind of activity when they were releasing embarrassing or potentially embarrassing information about Sony executives, employees. And then the third attack, which is where 100 million files, is what I read in the public press, 100 million files of customers, accounts, whatever, were stolen. I don't believe the lulsec guys or the social activist guys went and stole 100 million accounts. It was somebody who wants to try to monetize that. So is there an element within Anonymous that has more profit-driven motives? May well be. Again, that's another advantage, if you will, of kind of the amorphous nature of what it is. So, but that one example shows you kind of how broadly and how complex, from my argument, how complex the threat that companies, governments, NGOs, universities really are looking at. So that's why, again, it's part of the argument that you can't patch and pray anymore. You can't buy another application or another piece of hardware, although these are effective tools, and think that that's kind of going to defend you against something like an anonymous, just using them as an example, as an anonymous threat. So now we'll talk a little bit more. And, please.
Can I ask a question about the damages estimate? One of the premises, in my understanding, of some of these attacks was just to show that security was not nearly so good as it was supposed to be or as was implicitly advertised. Mm-hmm. And is there some calculation of sort of the reputational damage that people no longer believe that security is as good as it needs to be, though it never was? Or sort of like the cost for the company to actually provide security to the level that it ostensibly had promised before? Is that part of that calculation?
Cost, yes, and you bring up a good point. I apologize for not recalling the name of the institute that does the study, but they do kind of an agreed upon cost of a cost of a customer lost when an account's stolen. If no other damage is done other than the account is stolen, my credit card number's stolen, it costs, I think the ballpark is $250 to the company to repair that one account, whether it's to issue a new credit card, whether it's to call the call center and update that account. Then you look at reputational damage, and you see that more quickly reflected in stock price. And so when you see a substantial drop in the share value, that's usually a good estimation of reputational damage. Then you look at some companies when they're trying to up the security, to your point, so that they maintain or rebuild that trust in the customer base. They, with some companies, especially e-commerce, you can get an RSA token, as a second factor for authentication. So you look at revenue lost by Sony in this particular case. There's a very hard dollar amount that they lost per week because people weren't gaming, and you pay to game. They spent a lot of money in this particular case to, I think maybe they called it a welcome back package, so that if you will start gaming again, you get maybe some free hours, or you get, depends on what game you're in, maybe some virtual goods out of the process as well. So the dollar amount continues to climb, and anybody can make an argument that these are all factual amounts. It's kind of start arguing how many angels can dance on the head of a pin if you say it's 20 billion versus 21 billion, but it's all very, very substantial. Next group of slides that we talk about you'll kind of begin to see kind of my background in looking at the application of intelligence process to businesses today. I've worked with a lot of companies that have good security, some that could have better security, and still very few really kind of take a very collaborative point of view about how to kind of close all the gaps. From my experience, and you talk to law enforcement or intelligence officers as well, the bad guys will always work the gaps and the cracks. If the front door is securely locked, they'll go and check the back door. Same with the network. If you've locked down two-factor authentication with the main core of your network, but you recently made an acquisition overseas, that might be the way in. So there's always an alternate path in. And again, I'll offer up kind of my intelligence philosophy gained from the years when I had hair until today on the intelligence business. And I think one of the big arguments that you make from a business point of view about raising the level of your IT security program is it lets the decision makers make bolder decisions. If you're not worried about kind of the reputational cost or the brand damage, can we be more aggressive about pushing our gaming network out to different markets, and you've done a risk assessment, really a very systematic and methodical risk assessment, decision makers can spend the money, expand to new markets, try new things. So it always gives confidence to the leadership. Also, when you're doing intelligence, and again, I make the second point here is it's not what you heard or you read in the Wall Street Journal that morning. If that's part of it, you have to go to your company or your organization and say, from what we've read, using Sony as an example, from what we read, here's what our potential exposure would be in the same scenario. Say if we're an online gaming company, or if we have a very distributed network globally, and there's lessons to be learned from what happened here about exposures. But if you start just bringing the news to the leadership who's already read the New York Times or the Financial Times that morning, you'll be of minimal value to the company, obviously. You can also, as we all do with emails and all the ways we can communicate, you can numb the decision maker to what you have to bring to them. So I believe you only have so many opportunities in the course of a week, month, or year to your decision makers to bring information to them. So use that time very sparingly, and you want to condition them that when you walk in, you're going to be bringing them a well thought out issue. You're going to bring them the details of kind of how it's going to impact the company, and it's really worth their time to listening. You just keep throwing stuff over the transom very quickly, as I say, they'll just become desensitized to that, and it automatically gets funneled to the junk mailbox. Intelligence is absolutely an art. It's not a science. There's a lot of good tools. You can look out on the market and see a lot of the big names that are, some were given seed money by the CIA and the intelligence community and Department of Defense to kind of boost them up and develop some capabilities. These are very good tools, have a lot of capability, even some of it's not even been completely tapped. But it's a tool. You can't just hook this up to your servers and your network and suddenly full-blown intelligence comes out of it. It's still a very human process, which makes it softer, which makes it a little counterintuitive maybe to a hard science part of the corporation like IT, but it's absolutely the secret sauce of bringing the two together. You'll endure one small joke, and I'll date myself by giving it as far as it being an art, not a science. Tenement building here in Pittsburgh, the heat goes out. They call the plumber in to fix the heat. Plumber goes down to the basement, looks around, looks at all the pipes, looks at the furnace, kind of gauges the size of the building, pulls out a hammer, walks over to a certain pipe and raps it really hard with the pipe. The furnace kind of shudders and you hear it rumble and you feel the heat come back on. The landlord says, "Send me a bill." A week later he gets the bill and the bill says $1,000 for fixing the furnace. Landlord says, "Well, I'm glad it happened, but $1,000? So he calls the plumber and says, "Can I get an itemized statement?" He says, "Sure." week later, he gets the itemized statement. It says, $1 for rapping on the pipes with a hammer, $999 for knowing where to rap on the pipe with a hammer. So it's the experience. It's knowing how the whole process comes together, the tools you can leverage within inside the company, and how it needs to be presented to the decision makers is the science part of intelligence. So I mentioned no software can replace the analyst. They can make him or her time be used more effectively. It can pre-screen, it can aggregate, it can correlate. But again, you need that human in the process. There's no argument about it from my point of view. A good analyst within a company or within the organization are respected, but they're not always liked, because most of the time they should be bringing two things to the table to the decision maker. They're going to be bringing a problem, hopefully one that the decision makers are always aware of, but at the same time they're going to be bringing some courses of action, some clarity to it, so that the decision makers can, again, make that bold decision and make the right business decision. What they bring to the process that's liked is that clarity, some courses of action that the decision makers can make with some rigor and not just kind of seat of the pants kind of decision making. And one of my points that's often quoted is intelligence can be cheap, fast, or accurate, and you only get to pick two, because there's always a combination there that it's if you want it fast and you want it cheap, there's a margin of error there that's not going to give the decision maker the level of confidence. Questions, comments, observations? Good? What this organization needs to look like, again, wherever you're at, is it's going to be the model with your industry sector, because you don't really see this yet. At the end of the presentation, I'll speak to some initiatives that I think are absolutely on the right path and may be the catalyst behind bringing this forward into the industry, but it's still starting. You have to look at all the threats to the business and the infrastructure. As we talked before, is it a threat to the business as far as doing business, or if you're an online gaming company, the threat to the infrastructure is your business, or if you're an e-commerce platform, the same way. Real-time detection and awareness, that's usually a point where I don't get into heated debates, but energetic discussions sometimes with the IT security community. We have real-time monitoring. We log every transaction, every action. We've got it. And my question is, who's looking at those logs? When's the last time anybody looked at those logs? Better yet, when somebody did a penetration test, did a good job, did exactly the way they were supposed to do it, what does the report look like? You know, usually it looks like a big giant printout. There's no what needs to be done from a business point of view, what really needs to be the priority of work here, what really needs to be addressed. So I'll argue that it happens, but it's usually not really real time. And real time is where you're going to make the difference. When you start to see an aberration, and when I say see, somebody's monitoring, one of the analysts in the programs I built, they have ownership of these logs. They look, God, it would be mind-numbing to sit and watch the logs, but you build scripts or you build tools, but they have the responsibilities to be looking at that network. And usually one of the first things we do, no matter how kind of well you've mapped your network or how well you think you know the character of it, is what's normal. In most networks, and I understand and applaud it, uptime. If you've got good uptime and all the transactions are taking place, you know, the old saying, don't touch nothing. So you don't sometimes know what healthy looks like or what aberrations you may begin to see in the network. So an analyst, an intelligence analyst, that's exactly what they do for. They look for that outliers. They look for the thing that's going to be an early indication so that you can close a port, so that you can deactivate a token, so that you can compartmentalize part of the network and be ahead of the problem. Back to anonymous, to that point is, I don't want to incur the wrath of anonymous, but their technical skills can run the gamut. Some are very sophisticated and some aren't that sophisticated. So it's not that there's a little core of masterminds here that only they are the ones that could get into your network or get into that particular server farm. So it's not, to garble the expression, it's not rocket surgery. Most of these cases, when you look at the hacks or you look at the infiltrations, it was just things that should have been either tightened up, and more importantly, from my point of view, someone should have been watching and kind of seeing what the aberration was. Okay, I kind of like to put this up because sometimes when you talk about an intelligence program, especially if you're selling it within a corporation, it's like, well, okay, this is the pet project of the CIO, and he or she's going to use it. Then that's really not justifying in the corporation. Usually, without exception, a good program, a small team. These are not legions of people involved in the intelligence program. Can serve a lot of the customers. Obviously, you can read through here, but you start to get a lot of synergy. I'll bring out physical security or corporate, what's usually corporate security in the classic definition. Have a lot of peers and a lot of colleagues and have a great deal of respect for corporate security. Many of them come with really good law enforcement backgrounds. Sometimes those tend not to have strong IT security backgrounds. The point I'm backing into is most investigations, a lot of circumstances where corporate security is needing to be involved will impact the IT organization. They're going to be reaching across into IT for emails, for whether it's forensics, whether it's a litigation hold for certain documents or information. So there's more and more synergies there. And with your intelligence team, and usually the intelligence team will also kind of address the digital investigations piece, and I'll kind of explain that. You really bring a service to corporate security. You begin to develop constituencies all across the corporation for what this small core team can provide to the company. All employees, and the tiny little asterisk says that a sanitized version assumed it will be made public. Not that we don't trust all our employees, but on that level, it's usually more along the lines of training and education, better password creation, being aware of malware that may be on the machines, or just good safe computing type of activities. What we found is, especially with all employee communications, if you can tie it to a real world event, again, whether it's something that's happened in the news or something that's happened within the company that's public information, that obviously reinforces why it's important. So you got a whole spectrum of individuals in the company that you're serving here. Questions, comments?
So when you look at a company that deploys firewalls and intrusion prevention devices and aggregates all logs into a big database and maybe uses some canned, maybe even some custom scripts to analyze those logs and that, and something's found, it seems like the human nature is to say, hey, that was a money well spent, you did a good job there, let it keep running. Where really you need to hire a couple more people to really understand everything that is being collected and what more can be done to analyze it. How are companies getting to the point where they're going to say, I'm going to invest more money so that we can find more things more quickly?
And you bring up the kind of the crux of the situation is, if you're spending what at times seem like astronomical amounts of money for the new release of whatever application you're using, or building another data center, those budgets loom so large that it's hard to, on one level, it's hard to make the argument for those analysts. Then on the other hand, when you look at the cost of those analysts and the success that they can bring to the program, it usually can go a long way to sell itself. You have to have, again, this is not disparaging anybody within the information technology community or the information security officer. They have to be able to kind of see it at that next level. If they think, Microsoft Tuesday putting in all the patches and making sure the network's partitioned logically and physically when it needs to be is good security, you're going to have a harder time. It's usually when it's an industry that either maybe has a high transaction rate and things are happening so fast and money can be lost so quickly, or if it's e-commerce and transactions can be impacted so quickly, or you're going into an industry that's kind of taken a big, bold step into technologies, whether it's utilities with the smart grid, then there's kind of that stepping out into the uncomfortable part of it that usually the leadership will say, we need something that can kind of help us with that part of the unknown. And then the Intel team begins to look like a good investment. And again, you know, it's like anything. You gotta earn your keep every day, and you gotta make sure you're bringing something to the table every day. But what we've discovered is when you have the data loss prevention program in place, or your log monitoring, or you even have a third party who is your MSS, when the analyst begins to look at all that, stuff just comes out of the woodwork. You know, little things that could be tweaked up, really no cost other than engineering time to tighten up a lot of things. And then the CIO and the rest of the corporation have a much better view of kind of how secure they are. So the argument is usually best served in an industry that's kind of stepping out into some uncertain areas. And deliverables, again, first blush, or when I have conversations sometimes with companies and you talk about an intelligence program, they think, well, then we'll just get a report. You know, state of the security or state of the threat. Well, there's a lot day in and day out that a small team will generate a lot of information to the company that's helpful. News analysis, I call it the CNN effect. The CEO on the way through the gym comes in the morning and he hears about company X being hacked, and he's all fired up and he calls the CIO into the office and calls the security people in the office and says, what are we going to do about this? Well, usually they're scrambling to try to figure out what he saw, and much less try to how to put it in context. If you have an Intel team and an Intel function, 9 times out of 10, you can already be ahead of that. So when he mentions, we'll use the TJ Maxx one we mentioned earlier, where they were hacked through a point of sale terminal in one of the stores. You've already hopefully been pushing out information. If you're a retailer, you've already been pushing out information to the part of your business that does point of sale. You've already told them, you know, these machines need to be configured in a certain way, or you need to bolt them down so they can't be physically traded out. So that when the CEO says that, what the heck are we doing about TJ Maxx type scenarios? You said we've already got it covered. The Intel team spends their day worrying about all the things that are keeping the leadership of the company and the revenue generating part of the company up at night. That's hopefully why they'll sleep more and the Intel team will be up at night. You get proactive, and there's a little bit of sprinting to get ahead of the company to get to that place where because there's a lot of corporate expertise and a lot of residual knowledge in any company. You know, they've been through it before. They've suffered the slings and arrows of a hack similar to it before. So once you get kind of up to that point, kind of a metric of the Intel team has kind of won its place at the table is you will start getting calls from one of the business units leadership. And they're about to make a decision, and they just kind of want your opinion. Whether they go in that direction or not, when they invite you to the conversation, your information's of value, and in the past you've earned some value to the company. So that's what you begin to see. I won't go through all of these. I'll try to couple of them that kind of stand out. I kind of talked across a lot of these actually at the same time. And I'll kind of, down here, the chief security officer. Again, if you use the classic definition of that being more the physical side. And again, you'll look at identity and access management, usually something solely in the purview of the information technology department. But its impact has a very broad physical security and employee safety impact. So you need to make sure the CSO's in on those conversations. And if there are threats or risks to them, they're involved with that. Sometimes they own access control, not uncommon in a big corporation. As I mentioned, if the Intel team is also doing the digital investigations in support of the CSO, that's a place where you can draw in a lot of information on logging, cameras, badging in and out, RSA tokens signing in. Did an employee badge in one facility, but he appeared to have remoted in through another geographic location? Those sort of things begin to add a lot of value to an investigation. And something that we found has been very beneficial when a company in an industry forms an Intel team and can devote those resources in that time. And again, I kind of will applaud the works of those teams. The value of that information when they share it to a light company who doesn't do this is really eye-opening. Whether they can commit resources to an Intel team, you will very quickly get very positive and constructive interaction from those other companies where you've looked at that problem in a way they just haven't had the cycles to take a look at. So it very quickly, you'll get validated within your company by sharing as best you can when it's non-proprietary information, by sharing with the rest of your industry. We worked a lot with the national labs. They obviously do a lot of research. Universities like SMU that have a lot of really innovative ideas that can be brought back into the corporate environment. Again, kind of just a line and block chart, but as we talk to, if you kind of have to look at the threats, if we looked at those, the 5 categories of threats that we had before, and if you can't see from the back, the intelligence function, the collection coordinator, security monitoring tools, and then investigative function. Collection coordinator is probably a term that rarely is muttered inside a corporation, but the collection coordinator is, as we talked before, that's the person very aptly with a good IT background, better yet a good IT security background, that knows how the logging's done, what the policies were on data loss prevention, what's the cycle and parts of the network are getting vuln tested, how the network is actually mapped. They draw all this information, and they're the ones that can feed it to the analyst so that they begin to can do the work. The analyst can be the one that's more focused on the issue or the threat actors, and the collection coordinator piece is the one that brings that in. To that point, when you look at security monitoring tools, that's probably the part that's in place in the company already, as we mentioned. Whatever AV you have, or if you've got a company doing your managing your services, you can plug in all that data that they're very religiously and conscientiously logging, but nobody's probably ever looking at. So you get to leverage those tools. So then also another point is when budgets get reviewed every year and people look at the cost of those monitoring tools or the hardware, and the Intel team can point to the additional analysis that's been done, the decisions that have been supported by this, the cost of those tools is amortized across the company, and they bring more value for dollar. So usually you'll get good interaction with the vendors when you explain what you're doing, and they just see another way. From their point of view, they're trying to sell as they're supposed to do. They see a value in interacting with you and supporting you and making you smarter about their tools as well. So a lot of synergy begins to develop with a small team of analysts when you kind of put them in the middle of all this mix. The digital investigation I mentioned before, that's many times when you see the team being able to reach across the aisle to the physical security and the corporate security team and bring a lot of value to them. Some of them, especially law enforcement, has certainly matured a lot, and there's a lot more IT skills and IT security skills within law enforcement, but still, most time you can bring something to the table for them as well. Not all, but just some of the sources that the Intel team can use. And another thing that always comes up is, well, what do you have to buy? Now, again, the secret sauce is the humans that have a kind of a very logical way of looking at a problem, drawing all that data that's in the company and bringing some logical conclusions. I've always said that a good intel analyst is an extrovert with an introvert's mind. Someone who's outgoing, who talks across the company, who engages people, who can draw out information, who can ask intelligent questions, and at the same time be introverted in the sense of being very lockstep and logical in their analysis so that when their conclusion comes out, they can defend it. As I mentioned before, good analysts are respected but not always popular. I guarantee you, as soon as you come to the company and say, we've got a big gaping hole here that's impacting revenue or potentially will impact the health of the company, as is human nature, first conclusion will be is somebody to push back and make an argument against why that's so. So you got to be able to defend. You got to be able to defend that point. As I mentioned, internal expertise, the labs, all these that we've kind of already touched on. There's a lot of information. There's a lot of data that an analyst, that the dedicated analyst can really bring to the table. And most is not at any expense or little expense, and many times travel or web conferences at most. So there's a lot of information that can be gained. And this question always comes up is information sharing. As I mentioned on that last slide, some of them was DHS and other government agencies, and especially if you're talking in regards to being a private corporation, or rather a public corporation. What is that information sharing relationship like? And really it can be summed up fairly well that, good morning, ma'am. We work for a top secret government agency, the nature of which is so confidential I dare not mention its name. I'm not even at liberty to tell you our names or why we're here. In fact, I've probably said too much already. I think it would be best if we left now. Good day. So some people would argue that that's pretty much the relationship between government information sharing and the private sector. A lot of information that the government has is classified by the nature of sources and methods. But I'm an advocate, having come from that side as well, I'm an advocate for a lot of information can be shared, sanitized, so that the government, frankly, serves to benefit from the expertise that's out in the corporate world. I think that's probably the underappreciated piece, that there's a lot of, that companies day in and out deal with problems that they've got to fix. They're dependent on their company's health for that they've dealt with head on and come up with a solution. It may be an 80% solution, but by golly, they've dealt with it and they've fixed the problem. I think there's a lot of information can flow back, and that the government should be much more willing to embrace that relationship. This final slide is the final point. I mentioned earlier that actually I think the university here is kind of taking that first big bold step in the right direction. This week at RSA out in San Francisco, there's the unclassified cyber intelligence pilot taking place, and that's under the auspices of SEI. If you look on the website, you'll see a lot of good information on that, kind of where that pilot's going and what their objectives are. And without either patting myself on the back, but at the same time applauding the effort by the university, what we've talked about today and what they're trying to do very closely align. It's the argument that the threat has risen to a level across the spectrum, whether you're government, corporations, or private entities, that the intelligence or the response has to be more sophisticated than what we've done in the past. So, if you look at that website, and it is sponsored by the Director of National Intelligence, so there's a lot of horsepower behind trying to do this right and bringing the right piece of the government equation to the table. I think you'll see a lot of insight. And this is a good time for questions, or at least I'll offer up one war story, whatever you guys decide. So. Yes?
So a lot of the principles that you talked about seem like they might work for a large company which has the resources to invest in something like this. What about if you are a 4-person, 5-person company where you can't really afford a couple of analysts?
When it's a small company, you're right, it becomes a matter of scale. But I do think, even if it's a small company, looking at the problem, and again, as I said early on, president company accepted and not in any way impugning the IT-centric nature of security sometimes in corporations. If you can look at the problem in a broader sense, the kind of the factor in the human factor as to why there's a problem, I think even a small company can address some of the issues.
I found it pretty interesting that towards the beginning when you were talking about your bridge philosophy, a lot of the things that you were mentioning were also things that we talk about as principles when we talk about usable security in academia, or things like talk about give users actionable information instead of technical details. So it's interesting to see that coming from two angles, we sort of reach some of the same conclusions.
Well, bring up a point, if I may, one last, is the intelligence analysis that the team does, to your point, actually has two portions. It always has two portions. It has, within government parlance, it's called a tear line. The top half is the business impact. The analyst writes, what is the impact to the business? That goes to the C-levels, that goes to the business unit owners, that goes to the financial committees as well. The other half of it is the technical analysis. Why is that a problem to this company? And from the technical point of view, what happened or what's the risk? That goes to the IT organization so that they have something they can do something with. They can address the problem, but at the same time, there's a piece that goes to the leadership so they know what the problem is. The beauty of that is when the IT organization has to turn resources to fix that problem, you've already kind of pre-sold it to the leadership. If they say, well, what the heck have you got 20 people working on this issue? It's like, it's because of problem X. Oh, good job. Keep up the good work. So there's a lot of synergies there once you get started that you really realize.
So as companies are more affected by these security issues, and even universities, I kind of wonder with some of the security at this university, was it because they were taken to court by RIA and had to do something to be able to catch copyright violators? Is that why their security improved? Or were they being proactive? Is it still mainly that companies have to have something really bad happen before they act? Or are people starting to see that it's their advantage to act early?
I can't speak to the copyright issue, but to the latter, I think it's human nature sometimes that you wait till something bad happens. But as I mentioned, when you see companies or industries starting to move out into areas where they're not as familiar, whether it's mobile payment platforms or when I mentioned the utility industry about the smart grid, that's where you begin to see a little bit of proactiveness on their part. Is do they go about it as comprehensively as they should? You know, we all live in reality and there's budgets and other factors, but that's where you begin to see it. But I'll be honest, I think the result is a lot of times it's only when something happens or they're on the precipice of something happens and they'll devote the resources to it. That's not the way you want to have to sell that within your company. But as the expression goes, never let a good crisis go to waste. If that's when you can make your case and you can make it factually and soundly, absolutely go about it.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.